We begin my top 30 remaining quarterback rankings for week 16. Players who played on Thursday night are not included in these rankings. So if you notice, for instance, Bo Nix missing or Justin Herbert, that's why. We begin with quarterbacks that I think are probably in that uh, mid to high end QB3 range that I would really avoid if possible. We have DTR, Spencer Rattler, Aiden O'Connell, Drew Lock, Bryce Young, and Mason Rudolph. DTR has thrown exactly 100 yards and no touchdowns with 3 interceptions in 2 games in which he's played more than 23% of the snaps. Even in an advantageous matchup against Cincinnati, who do allow the third most points to quarterbacks, I really would try to avoid him. He does have a decent amount of rushing upside, but we haven't seen him throw a touchdown yet, and he's thrown 3 interceptions. So, once again, if possible, absolutely avoid him. Spencer Rattler has thrown 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions on the season. He's played a couple games in which he's thrown neither. Here against Green Bay, they do allow the fifth fewest points to quarterbacks, so it's a really tough matchup to begin with, but he also is throwing to uh, practice squad type players, at least among his wide receivers. And so I would absolutely avoid him against Green Bay if possible. Aiden O'Connell has scored more than 10 points 2 times on the season, and he even had a QB 13 finish with over 19 points against Kansas City. Here against Jacksonville, they do allow the most points to fantasy quarterbacks. It's still Aiden O'Connell, though. If I could avoid him, I would. He probably has the most amount of upside he's ever going to have here against Jacksonville, but he also carries a tremendous amount of risk. Drew Lock certainly isn't getting it done as a passer, at least in the 2 games in which he recently played, but he did have at least 57 rushing yards in both performances, with a rushing touchdown in the first week in which he started. So here against Atlanta, it's a good matchup. It's just that it's Drew Lock, and more importantly, the Giants' offensive line is atrocious. And so even in what is a plus matchup, I really would try to avoid him at all costs. After a solid stretch of games without an interception, Bryce Young has thrown 2 touchdowns and 3 interceptions in the past 2 games. Here against Arizona, they do allow the ninth fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks. I do think he's a better quarterback than all of the players below him. It's just in a pretty tough matchup, I would really try to avoid him. In 3 of the 5 games in which Mason Rudolph has played a majority of the snaps, at least 53%, he has scored over 10 fantasy points. He also had 9.9 in another one. Here against Indianapolis, while it is a somewhat friendly matchup, he's just not that great of a quarterback. So he still carries a tremendous amount of risk, but I would prefer him to every single one of the quarterbacks below him. And now we have quarterbacks that I think are probably in that mid to low end QB2 range. We have Smith, Stroud, Jones, Rush, May, Penix, Wilson, and Stafford. So Geno Smith in each of the past 5 weeks has finished no better than the QB 19. Here against Minnesota, they allow the eighth fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks. I think he's going to have a pretty rough outing. I would still prefer him just because he's a better player with better skill position players than some of the guys below him. I would prefer him to that tier of quarterbacks, but I would still prefer 23 other remaining starting quarterbacks over him. And now we have CJ Stroud, who in every single game since week 6, besides one, has failed to top 15 fantasy points. Here against Kansas City, while you would think the game script is in his favor in the sense of they'll probably be losing, Kansas City does allow the 11th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks. Even with the return of Nico Collins, we just haven't seen the upside for Stroud. The offensive line is atrocious, and so I do think he's a must avoid if possible, but I would still trust him over the quarterbacks below him. Mac Jones has scored over 18 fantasy points in 2 of the past 3 weeks. The issue, though, is in the past 2 games, he's thrown 4 total interceptions. Here against Las Vegas, while it is a friendly matchup for him, I still think he's going to have a multi-turnover game, and I still would try to avoid him if possible. Cooper Rush, ever since taking over for Dak Prescott, has had 2 top 10 weeks for us in fantasy, including a QB9 finish this past week. Even in an advantageous matchup here against Tampa Bay, who is second most in terms of allowing fantasy points to quarterbacks, I still think that he's a pretty risky play, and I do think he has a multi-turnover game. Drake May has finished as the QB 10 and 11 in the past 2 weeks in which he's played. Here against Buffalo, though, they do allow the 10th fewest points to quarterbacks. I do think he's going to see a tremendous amount of volume, but it is a really tough matchup. And so if you can avoid him, I would, but he does have rushing upside, so there is a chance that he has a decent game. And now we have Michael Penix, who's taking over for Kirk Cousins. It's really hard to project how he's going to perform. The one thing, though, that he has going for him is his arm. He absolutely, unlike Cousins, is going to be able to challenge the deep area of the field, which is going to make the offense more effective. And so I do like Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Darnell Mooney, as well as Bijan Robinson, all more than I have with Kirk Cousins starting. I'm tentatively excited to see what he's going to do. But until we do see how he performs, I would be a little bit reserved in terms of deciding to start him. Russell Wilson, while he does get to play Baltimore, which on paper seems like a friendly matchup, it is a divisional game, and the last time in which he played them, he had 6 fantasy points. So I do think this is a little bit of a trap game, but he definitely has upside in an advantageous matchup. Matt Stafford has had a QB 9 or better finish in 3 of the past 5 weeks, but he's also had a QB 22 or worse finish in 2 of the past 5 weeks, including this past week. Here against the Jets defense started out the season really hot under Saleh, but ever since they fired him, they've definitely regressed. The one thing, though, that I do worry about with Stafford is the pass rush of the Jets. They're starting to get a little bit healthier, and the Rams' offensive line I really do not trust. So I still think he's a fine QB2, but I do think he's going to have a little bit of trouble this week. And now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid to high-end QB2s to potentially low-end QB1s. We have Aaron Rodgers, Caleb Williams, Tua Tagovailoa, A-Rich, Jared Goff, and Patrick Mahomes. So Aaron Rodgers has been fantastic, especially this past week, posting a QB4 overall finish. I definitely didn't see that coming. And so even in an advantageous matchup against the Rams, it is a little bit tough to trust Aaron Rodgers because he really hasn't been consistent for us in terms of positive performances. And so I would be a little bit cautious, but the game script should be in his favor in terms of a passing volume. Caleb Williams has thrown 8 touchdowns to no interceptions in the past 4 weeks. Now, he has had some turnover-worthy plays, so you could definitely argue he's been a little bit lucky in that regard. But against Detroit, even though he started out the first half basically being blanked, he definitely came on strong in the second half. Detroit's defense is absolutely vulnerable at this point due to the injuries in which they've sustained. And so I do think that he's going to have a decent second half of the game once again. And so I think he's going to be a high-end QB2, but I think it's going to be very rough getting there. Tua, after a really strong stretch of games, definitely came back down to earth this past week. He is dealing with a hip injury. He was limited, but I do think he ends up playing. Here against San Fran, they allowed the 6 fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, so that is something to worry about, but I don't think he's going to have the terrible performance that he had this past week once again. Anthony Richardson, while a terrible real-life quarterback, has been decent in advantageous matchups for us for sure. He scored over 20 fantasy points in 2 of the past 4 weeks. And so this is a plus matchup, which is why I'm a little bit higher on him than I would usually be. I think he ends up with a rushing touchdown and a passing touchdown, but I still think he has a multi-turnover game. Jared Goff is coming off a fantastic performance in which he had over 40 fantasy points. Against Chicago, the past time they played, though, he only had 16. I do think that he's a strong play just because of the offense, but I don't think he carries the upside that we saw specifically this week against Chicago. They do allow the 2nd fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks. And so I think he's a solid low-end QB1, but I wouldn't be expecting a top 5 performance or anything. Patrick Mahomes has thrown 7 touchdowns to no interceptions in the past 4 weeks. Here against Houston, it's definitely a matchup that he can exploit. I think he's going to have a solid game and is quite efficient, but I don't think he's going to need to throw a ton, so I don't think he's going to have a fantastic fantasy performance. But I still think that he's a top 12 option. If you like what you're seeing and hearing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. And make sure you check out my tight end, wide receiver, and running back rankings videos as they come out. Tight ends and quarterbacks are coming out today, and tomorrow are wide receivers and running backs. Thanks. And now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid to low-end QB1s, but I wouldn't consider likely candidates to be the QB1 this week. We have Brock Purdy, Jordan Love, Jaden Daniels, Sam Darnold, Kyler Murray, and Lamar Jackson. Brock Purdy is playing against Miami. They do allow the fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, and Brock Purdy in 2 of the past 3 weeks has scored less than 4 fantasy points, but he also had a QB7 finish against Chicago, who do allow the 2nd fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks. And so I think here against Miami, it is going to be a potential shootout of a game. And so I do like Brock Purdy in this matchup, but I don't think he's going to have one of those incredible games that we see against inferior competition. Jordan Love has thrown 7 touchdowns to no interceptions in the past 4 weeks. And so it's great to see that he's remaining turnover free through the air. Here against New Orleans, they do allow the 14th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, but I do think he throws a pair of touchdowns and is going to be a top 10 option. Jaden Daniels is playing against Philadelphia this week. So the last time in which they played, he had 13 fantasy points. But he's also been on a tear recently, posting 3 straight top 10 performances, including against New Orleans, who isn't an easy matchup for sure. And so I do think that he's going to have a better performance, and I do think he scores on the ground. And now we have Sam Darnold against the Seattle Seahawks. So he's thrown 12 touchdowns to only 1 interception in the past 5 weeks. That one pick did come this past week against the Chicago Bears. That is a much tougher matchup than Seattle, though. I do think he's going to be able to exploit them en route to a top 10 finish. Kyler Murray has been very tough to trust for us in fantasy. I definitely was somebody that thought he was going to have a better fantasy season than he's had this season. Here against Carolina, though, this is absolutely a matchup he can exploit. I think he rushes for a touchdown and throws one. Lamar Jackson has only had 1 finish lower than QB12 on the entire season. However, that was against Pittsburgh. It's still really tough to project him to not be a top performer, even though he was the QB23 the last time he played them. I think he's going to bounce back against them. He's on an absolute tear, and if Josh Allen didn't exist, he would probably be the MVP. And so I think he's going to have a better game this time against Pittsburgh, but I still think he has a turnover. And now we have quarterbacks that I think are firmly entrenched as elite QB1s and are likely candidates to be the QB1 this week. We have Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Joe Burrow, and Josh Allen. All right, so with Jalen Hurts, he's playing against Washington this week, and while they do allow the 12th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, he has been on a tear recently, finishing as a QB4 and the QB6 in the past 2 weeks. And so I think he gets a rushing touchdown and throws a couple of passing touchdowns this game and is a top 5 option. Baker Mayfield is playing against Dallas, and so first of all, it's a fantastic matchup. But second of all, I think they're going to try really, really hard to get Mike Evans 1,000 receiving yards. And so I think Baker Mayfield is going to be a huge beneficiary there. And so while he's definitely turnover prone recently, he's also touchdown prone. And so I think he's a top 5 option this week, and he's going to put up a pretty solid performance with 3 passing touchdowns. Joe Burrow has finished as a top 11 QB in each of the past 6 weeks he's played. Here against Cleveland, he only had around 14 fantasy points last time they played, but he's also on an absolute tear recently. I don't think there's anybody on Cleveland that can guard Jamar Chase, T. Higgins either, and so I think he's going to have a fantastic day for us en route to a top 2 finish. And finally, we have Josh Allen, who has put up over 90 fantasy points for us in the past 2 weeks. If you owned him, it was pretty hard to lose your fantasy week. I'm sure some people got unlucky. If you played against Devontae Adams, for instance, this past week, sure. But it's basically impossible to not have him projected as a QB1. And now I'm not going to be projecting 3 passing touchdown, 3 rushing touchdown games for him. That would just be ridiculous. But I still think that he's easily the top option for us, and I think he's going to absolutely crush New England. And so to conclude, quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to high-end QB3s, we have DTR, Rattler, O'Connell, Locke, Young, and Rudolph. Quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to low-end QB2s, we have Geno, Stroud, Jones, Rush, May, Penix, Wilson, and Stafford. Quarterbacks in that mid to high-end QB2 range to potentially low-end QB1 range, we have Rodgers, Williams, Tua, A-Rich, Goff, and Mahomes. Quarterbacks that I think are mid to low-end QB1s, but probably not candidates to be the QB1. We have Purdy, Love, Daniels, Darnold, Murray, and Jackson. And then quarterbacks that I think are firmly entrenched in the elite tier and are likely candidates to be the QB1. We have Hurts, Mayfield, Burrow, and Allen. All right, you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Remember that players who played on Thursday night are not included in these rankings. So if you notice somebody missing and it's, say, Bo Nix or Justin Herbert, that's why. And so, yeah, let me know who I have too high and too low, and make sure you check out my other positional rankings ahead of Week 16. I wish everybody good luck in the playoffs, and I hope you crush your matchups.